Look at me while I'm talking to you. We say in pain or exasperation to those who have turned away, putting us out of sight and by implication out of mind. The simplest way for anyone to throw out our attentions, to block our access, is to look away. The barman who does not want to take an order will not meet the customer's eye. The pedestrian who has stepped out in front of the car looks into the middle distance to avoid the motorist glare. An especially chilling way to deny another person is to stare straight through them as if they were just not there. This is precisely the look of many portraits where the sitter is supposedly a cut above. The royal portrait, say, or the duke or horseback. But most portraiture aims for some kind of a connection. The Italian artist Giulio Paolini made the point in the 1960s by showing just how disconcerting it feels if this communion is deliberately thwarted. Paolini displayed a black and white reproduction of a Renaissance painting, Lorenzo Lotto's portrait of a young man, which shows a beautiful youth staring very candidly and captivatingly back at the viewer. Or so it seems. But Paolini killed that illusion at a stroke simply by calling his version Young Man Looking at Lorenzo Lotto. Common sense says this can only be true, that the sitter's eyes were always on Lotto where he worked. But common sense is exactly what we naturally suppress when looking at the eye-to-eye portrait. It is our willing suspension of disbelief, our contribution to the occasion. And if the young man is no longer looking at us, if his eyes are refocused on someone else, then the party is over. The painting withdraws, becomes the record of two dead people looking at each other in some previous century, an effect of a deflation and exclusion. It is the end of the rapport most portraitists want, and exactly the opposite of self-portraitures as bearing eye-to-eye transmission of a first-person encounter. But an inept self-portrait will prove Poloni's point quite unintentionally just by bulging the eyes. The artist gets into a loop of looking at himself in the glass and reproducing that look that means nothing but itself. The Swiss-born painter Antoine Graf is doing his best to see what he looks like. Visor in position, brows pinched with effort. He poses as if turning aside from his latest commission, a portrait of some portly and presumably once famous patron. But the pretense is not plausible for a moment. The Graf in the picture, who wants to show himself doing what he does best. He was a very successful portraitist, whose sitters include Schiller, Gluck, and Frederick the Great, cannot really be working on that portrait, since he must be working on this self-portrait instead. And sure enough, he is trying so hard to paint both eyes in focus that you know he's really painting his own face. Graf's gaze switches, swithers. He cannot see us for the struggle to see himself. A few decades earlier, Jean Baptiste Simon Chardin looks over the top of his pince-nez, one eyebrow raised with a perceptible interest in an attitude of scrutiny that could not appear more sociable by comparison. The pose is almost humorous. Who is not familiar with the rhetoric of lowering one's spectacles as if pretending to consider someone else more pointedly? And the artist is at home in his jaunty bandana, neck close, loosely knotted against the cold, a note of domestic intimacy that runs through his work. But Chardin, now in his 70s, is both watchful and grave. His eyesight failing and the smell of the oil paint he had used for half a century now making him ill. Chardin was forced to give up oil for pastel instead. The light focusing through the lens, the steel frames, the eyes with their glint of curiosity, all are achieved with this tricky medium, so easily blended and yet so fragile and fugitive. Chardin is one of those artists whose self-portrait comes at a surprise, not because the face is so intelligent, for he has to be at least this clever to be the greatest still life painter in art, but because it exists in the first place. Born in Paris in 1699, he never left the city except for a trip to Versailles. He has nothing to say about the wars, politics, or public misery of his times, still less the private excesses of the aristocracy, although he must have seen it all, for he had a city center flat in the Louvre. Chardin stayed at home, secretive, industrious, painting his apricots, strawberries, and teacups, having the softness of a dead hair, the molten glow of a cherry. His power of touch runs all the way from the silvery condensation on a glass of water to the reflected glory inside a copper pan and the dawny cheek of the housemaid dreaming over her dishes. Diderot, his earliest champion, called him the great magician, trying to fathom the mysteries of his art, of those muffled rooms where everything is misty and slightly distanced, and the warm air circulates like a breath. But nobody ever saw him paint, and scarcely a single anecdote attaches to Chardin's life. That he should have left anything as personal as a self-portrait goes against the person of his art. That it is afterwardly turned and makes such vivid eye contact is even less to be expected, for the look is distinctly interpersonal, making a quizzical connection with the viewer from the center of the image, the perceptual heart of the picture. Chardin turns the same unhurried, penetrating gaze upon himself normally used to gauge the weight of a plume, the quiddity of an egg. You feel that it is to be one of his subjects, and what it is to be Chardin, eyes testing the truth of life directly. Rembrandt is acting with his eyes. He hooks you by reeling back and showing the whites. The etching has been given the title Self-Portrait, Wide-Eyed, but it might as well be called Shocked to See You. It is as if you personally have caused this effect. You come before him, and he reacts. That is the 1-2 action of the image. The meeting of eyes amounts to an incident, and it is the same with almost all of Rembrandt's self-portraits. He paints the eyes as pinpricks in shadow, or black holes, or dark discs you have to search for in the gloaming, trying to make the man out. He squints and he leers and he creases up to get a better look at you, a better sense of who you might be, identity always at issue. One of Rembrandt's contemporaries, the Florentine poet and painter Lorenzo Lippi, goes even further with this line of inquiry. This idea that the artist's eyes do not just follow, but actively seek you out, questioning who you are, with a comic trepidation in his case. Lippi turns timidly towards us from the safety of the shadows, one eye out of sight, as if hiding round the corner, the other swaggering fearfully in its socket. Who is there? The picture puts everyone on the spot. Lippi's ambition, he said, was to write poetry as he spoke and to paint as he saw, and this likeness is quick and colloquial. But it is also a neat parody of the eyeballing business of a self-portraiture. Here is an artist bold enough to paint a portrait of yourself, yet who seems almost too scared to look. He has one eye on a viewer's amusement. Lippi seems to have been better known for his humor than his portraits in any case, spending much of his life at the court of Innsbruck painting, respect for likeness of the aristocrats, while at the same time writing a serial mock epic satirizing their behavior and mores to the mirth of devoted readers by whom. His jesting image is now in the Uffiz's self-portrait collection, still amusing the people of Florence. Unlike most of the many hundreds of paintings in the collection, it was not made especially for the occasion. It seems to have its current neighbors in mind, a mouse that hardly dares squeak among the great lines all around it, whose pomp it quietly mocks. With his one-eyed peep, Lippi achieves in a blink what is more, what other artists can only hope for, intimacy of a connection, a kind of a wink, in his case, that immediately brings the self-portrait to life. Where to look? Anywhere but the mirror is an answer for the rare artist who rejects the rhetoric of intimacy. One of the few self-portraits to avoid eye contact altogether is also one of the greatest, painted by Titian in his mid-70s. But now, the artist's patrons have long since included popes, dukes, doges, and most of the crowned heads of Europe, and he showed himself as splendidly dressed as any of them, wearing the gold chains given him by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who is supposedly to have bowed his own knee to retrieve one of Titian's dropped brushes, a folktale so gratifying to later artists that the modern one painted the royal genuflection. Titian sits at a table, this painter of kings and the kings of painters, one hand tensed against it, the other braced upon his thigh with the fingers powerfully outspread. A fellow artist who had been admitted to his studio in Venice reported that in these later years, Titian often painted directly with his fingers. And one might imagine that the artist painted these magnificent hands with his own fingers, his supreme sense of touch evident in their very tips. But Titian is not painting in this self-portrait, of course. He's waiting, and this is the central tension of the picture. The body faces the front, massively present, but the eyes turned away towards some invisible point beyond the picture. That you should still be here, that he should be here at all. These are the burdensome but inevitable conditions of a self-portraiture, of appearing and being seen. But Titian manages to command your attention by diverting it, his eyes glancing free of yours. Where to look when submitting oneself to scrutiny? It is a question that presents itself to the public-minded self-portraitist every time. In reality, we usually have some sense of who might be looking at us, especially if the circumstances are familiar. But artists can only see one person looking back from the mirror and have to imagine all the rest. Anyone and everyone who might one day see their image to compose a representative face. The politician filmed in some satellite studio, unable to see his interrogator, may be analogous, having no rival eyes on which to latch and forced to frame expression without any guiding response. Under these circumstances, interviewees frequently look up, down or wanderingly off-center, flustered by the voice in their ear, infuriated by the questions, or just withdrawn into tense concentration. The eyes of self-portraits can expose the artist in just this way as dazed or perplexed, lost in thought or self-consciousness, or just defeated by the harsh technicalities. But few have retreated so far into self-consciousness as to have forgotten the world altogether. No matter how intimate the exchange between self and self-image, not many self-portraitists addressed only themselves, muttering alone in the studio. Self-portraiture is rarely an act of total introspection. Attention is what it generally seeks. Some artists aim straight for the public address. Others do so while making a pretense of seemingly privacy, lowering the eyes, looking away off into the distance. Still others simply want to appear intimate, without giving much away. Joshua Reynolds managed to combine all three just by playing upon vision as a conceit. Reynolds painted a great number of self-portraits with the public squarely in mind, and many of them are unbearably self-serving. But in the best and most original, painted in his mid-20s, when he was just up to London from a Devonshire village and about to set off for the glories of Rome, his sights are set on the future, and the road is open before him. The dynamic young hero stares straight ahead, shielding his eyes against the light with one hand, Literally, he's looking at himself in the mirror, but the gesture implies far wider horizons. With the mouth stick held across the body like a sword, he also looks ready for the cut and the thrust. He is on guard, the artist as a saluting swordman. It is a variation on the studio's self-portrait. The palette, the stick for steadying the hand at the canvas, even a hint of that canvas, but such an advance on the usual scenario. Reynolds make a character of himself in a drama that is all about seeing and being seen and trying to get a better look at the world and himself and his audience and his painting. The gesture is pointedly specific yet all encompassing. And then comes a further twist. His eyes are so deep in shadow, like those of Rembrandt, Reynolds' hero, that it is impossible to tell whether they are truly fixed upon the viewer, and the implication of that shielding hand. What is more, is that it is in any case too bright to make out what lies ahead, that the artist can hardly see. Artist and viewer are shapes in the night, yet the hand against the light tells of a sighting. Reynolds painted himself in Rembrandt beret, in the doctoral robes of Oxford University, contemplating a bust of Homer in the manner of Aristotle in Rembrandt's etching. His sense of achievement was highly developed, and his self-portraits are ceremonial. The one painted when he got the freedom of his hometown, and the one for the king when he took over the Royal Academy, and made for public display within a month or two, usually at the Royal Academy. But he sometimes produced less grandstanding works in which he comes more modestly downstage. In a late painting, Now Dive, he cups a hand to his ear, the better to hear us in a poignant reprise of this early gesture. His vision would eventually fade as well. Both pictures have a theatrical intimacy, Garrick on stage, that seems to single you out, to signal to you and you alone. They crave and declare an audience with these focusing gestures, but although Reynolds salutes the viewer, he has eyes not just for you, but the whole world.